Hello to everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the Getting On with Agroforestry session, learning from experience and working together to get more agroforestry happening in the UK. I hope you're all in the right place. If not, this is going to be great as well, whatever you were planning to be in. I'm Olly Rodker. I'm on the coordinating group of the Landworks Alliance. And I recently co-wrote a publication for Landworks Alliance about agroforestry called The Promise of Agroforestry. And it's been a long-standing interest of mine. We've got four brilliant speakers here looking at different aspects of agroforestry today. They are Andy Dibben from Abbey Home Farm, who's a grower there at Abbey Home Farm in the Cotswolds, Hannah Jones from the Farm Carbon Toolkit, Professor Stephen Newman from Biodiversity International, and Helen Cheshire from the Woodland Trust. And the plan for this hour-and-a-half session is we'll hear from those four speakers who've all got presentations for 10 or 12 minutes, and then we're just going to open up to the floor for questions and points. Now you should be able to see along the bottom of your screen in the bottom toolbar a Q&A icon, and if you go into that you can enter a question, type in a question, and my colleagues from Landworks Alliance, Brigitte and Olly Craigan, will be keeping a track of the questions, and then we'll address them to one or more of the speakers at the end. So we'll go through all the presentations and then do a whole sort of final period of questions and points. If you haven't got so much of a question, a direct question, you want to make a general point or provide some information or make other related comments, then there's the chat bar, the chat bar that people are currently saying hello in and saying where they're from and what they're doing. If you haven't done that already, please feel free to put something in there, and we can see the range of people we've got there and where we're all from. This session is being recorded like all the ORFC sessions. Hopefully that's okay with everyone. There is a process. If you don't want to be in the recording, I think you need to indicate in the chat bar, and you can turn off your video. Well, it is off already, you can't be seen, and you can be taken out of it. Actually, that doesn't apply in this case because nobody's video is here. I'm sorry, I'm in the previous session where it was different. We had all the faces up on the screen, forgive me. So yeah, we'll start off. I'll just say a couple of words about where LWA, the Landworks Alliance, fits into this, and then we'll get started with the speakers, and Andy will be first following me. I think it's just as a sort of introduction, Landworks Alliance is probably most well known for working around food and food and farming systems, but it was always one of the key aims for the Landworks Alliance that we would also be a home for foresters and people involved in woodland management, and that's partly because we see sort of land work in a general sense as the key value rather than specific types of land work, and because we want to actually provide a bit of a bridge between farming and forestry in a context for the last 100 years in the UK in which they've been pretty divided and very much you do one or the other and never the twain shall meet. And hopefully now what we're seeing in lots of different ways is that bridge being crossed, and farming and forestry are aligning a little bit more, and there's more interaction, and more farms are looking at tree systems, and people also may be involved in forestry and woodland management are maybe looking at other ways that they can do woodland management and other forestry outcomes. So I think that's a really great sign of progress at the moment. And in terms of our own recent publication, I think there were two key reasons to do that publication. It was partly because we wanted to look a little bit at some of the first and innovative systems from the last 20 years, some of which have been around a while now, and it's time to actually take some learning from those, because there's so much interest in people planting new schemes, and want to make sure that we're getting experience and good lessons from the existing schemes that we've got. And partly because of the potential for agroforestry to meet such a multiplicity of benefits in the context of the climate crisis and nature crisis and a food crisis. Agroforestry has a lot of multiple benefits, and particularly around tree planting. If we actually really got behind it and boosted it, supported it, invested in it, it can tick a lot of the boxes in terms of having increased tree cover and the benefits that can bring, but without necessarily losing farms and losing farmers. And it's really crucial that we get more people working on the land and more farmers and more good sustainable woodland management and not less, which is unfortunately the current trajectory. So that's what we're sort of the context of what we're hoping to see in general. And I think today the idea is that we can try and really look ahead and see how can we help each other to increase the amount of agroforestry in the UK. What are the barriers? What are the main ways that we can do more and see more agroforestry in the coming years and decades? Are there things that we're not doing that we could be doing? Obviously, we have our own limitations and resource restrictions, but that doesn't mean that there's not things we can do together. So that hopefully will be a bit of an outcome. All right, hopefully if there's no other points and no one indicates to me any reason not to, I'm going to turn to the first in our presentations and go to Andy Dibben from Abbey Home Farm. Thanks very much.
Cool, thanks Ollie. I'll just get my screen up. Cool. Hi everybody, welcome. Nice to have you all here to listen to this lovely subject. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the agroforestry system we established at the farm where I work, but I'm also going to talk to you a little bit also about the barriers to wider uptake of agroforestry across the country. So my name is Andy Dibben. I work at a farm in the Cotswolds called Abbey Home Farm. We're a 30-year-old certified organic farm. It's 660 hectares. It's a mixed farm, so we do full livestock, arable, horticulture. We've got a farm shop and a cafe on site where everything is targeted to. My job is head grower of everything horticultural. We've got 6 hectares growing over 80 different crop lines of fruit and vegetables, and we do that on a field scale, intensive market garden and protected cropping. So I started working at Abbey Home Farm 7 years ago, and when I arrived, they were already talking about agroforestry, possibly in the arable areas. There's a close relationship with Organic Research Centre. So yeah, so it was already on the cards. Nobody committed to it, but when I arrived, me and the owner, we seriously looked at bringing it in, and we decided on bringing it in the horticultural areas. So the technical name for this is silvo-horticulture. So that's vegetable crops and trees interacting. We started sort of the designing and planning process in 2016, 2017. We needed to reorientate a field to put trees in. We needed to establish understory, adjust rotations, and do a lot of planning and research. So we sort of started all this in 2016, 17. We didn't actually start putting any trees in the ground until 2017, and then carried on planting in 2018 and 2019. The main reason we wanted trees, or I wanted trees in our vegetable cropping areas, is we're a very windy site. And one of the big advantages of trees is the wind protection. But as a general reason, you know, a lot of agroforestry people want trees for the products the trees give you. We're interested in that as well, but the driving factor for us was the horticultural benefits it would bring to the crops, first and foremost, and then we looked at the crop lines we get out of the trees themselves. So those horticultural benefits, the big one, like I said, was reducing wind speed in the cropping areas. This will lead to higher yields, better quality crops. It will reduce water loss through evaporation. It will raise temperatures in the cropping areas due to microclimates created by the trees. And it will boost fungal networks under the soil beneath our crops as well. It'll also massively boost biodiversity. Now, as an organic horticulturalist, this isn't a charitable exercise. This is a serious necessity if you're not using any kind of pesticides or agrochemicals. So the tree habitat and the habitat associated around trees and agroforestry would boost loads of insects, which are crucial as both as pollinators for our crops, but really important part of our integrated pest management. Hoverflies, lacewings, ladybirds, massive predators of aphids. Ground beetles eat all the slugs. Songbirds eat lots of caterpillars. Birds of prey potentially eat rabbits, but more importantly, keep rabbits to the edges of the fields where they don't damage our crops. So like I said, biodiversity is a massive tool for us. It's not just a charitable exercise. And then we could also get extra crop lines out of the trees. So we have a very busy farm shop and cafe. We sell all the stuff we produce. The thing we don't produce anything like enough of is top fruit. We're on top of the Cotswolds. It's not a traditional orchard area, but we still thought we could have a good crack at growing some top fruit lines and trying to be self-sufficient. So lots of apples, pears, plums. And then the other crop line we were interested in getting out of the trees was wood chip. And that would be used to boost fertility as ramule wood chip on the green manures, but also used to create compost for use in protected cropping and in our propagation setup. While we were doing all the planning process over a couple of years, we just went into sort of 2 years of constant extreme weather of every different kind that happened. And it really brought home to us. And we started to realize all the added advantages of climate change adaptation and mitigation. So whether that's raising temperatures or dropping wind chill or, you know, allowing water to infiltrate faster, there's loads and loads of climate change benefits for agroforestry. We do a lot of education on the farm. I train a team of 3 apprentices, 2 trainees. We've got a preschool nursery on site. We do inner city schools come and stay on site. John Newman on the agriculture side is very well respected. We train a lot of farmers on site and we engage with the public a lot. And the trees are another great tool for teaching people all about the importance of trees in the landscape and within farming. And then the last reason we were very interested was the visual impact. The field we put our first lot of agroforestry in is right in front of our cafe and shop. And throughout the year, whatever season it is, we've got blossoms, fruits, autumn colour, biodiversity, the wildflower understory. They all add to the rich view out the front of the cafe and yeah, enrich that customer experience. So when we started to get going, we looked if there was any funding to support us in putting in the trees. We contacted the Woodland Trust. They were running a grant scheme called the PUR scheme through a hotel company that was, I presume it was carbon offset. And that is, we had to put in a detailed proposal to get hold of that money. That was very good because it focused our mind on exactly what we wanted to get from our system. And it was a necessity of the proposal, of the grant as well. So choosing trees, they must deliver on our aims. So we want wind protection, biodiversity, enrich the landscape and use for education. They must work on our soil types. That's Cotswold brash. It's very alkaline. It's fertile, but it's shallow, about 15, 20 centimeters of soil and then into rock. It must fit with the intended system. So that's field scale organic horticulture. And it must be a mix of diverse native trees. So that is to do with the Woodland Trust grant stipulation, but also in terms of biodiversity, native trees are the best things for attracting native biodiversity.
Andy,
so
Andy, sorry, someone's just put a request for you to slow down a little bit. I don't know if that's possible. And
yeah, I can do that. Yeah, it's fine.
Your time window that you're allowed.
Yeah.
If you can at all, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, that's cool, mate. Okay, so the thing about agroforestry is it's a complex subject. It involves growing of crops, interacting with trees, interacting with what's around the trees. So it's important to access really good knowledge. So there's 2 areas of knowledge. We wanted to access specific tree knowledge, especially around fruit. And then we also wanted to access system design knowledge as well. So as far as top fruit knowledge was concerned, there's 2 key parties we accessed knowledge from. One were a lovely couple called Rachel and Martin Sobel at Carey Organics in Herefordshire. We bought top fruit off them at different businesses we've worked at before, and it's always a very high quality. So we went and spent a day at their orchard, and they gave us what I can only call is the highest level of advice, specifically around commercial organic apple varieties for an organic system. And they were a fantastic source of advice. And then Kevin O'Neill at Walcott Organic Nursery, he is an amazing plantsman. His knowledge of apple trees is unsurpassable. And again, we got knowledge from him. And then my own knowledge, I used to be a Coppiced worker. So my own knowledge of Coppiced species of trees and hardwoods, British sort of tree biodiversity was pretty strong already. Then systems design, well, Wakeland's agroforestry, a trailblazer. So anyone doing agroforestry always looks at Wakeland's. We already had a close relationship through Veg with Ian Tolhurst at Tolhurst Organics, who we took a lot of advice from around trees, agroforestry and vegetables. Ben Raskin and Fred Benestro both have agroforestry projects not far from us, so we took a lot of advice from them as well. So the final tree selection, we went for 96 apple trees, 13 different varieties, all in succession through the cropping season. 9 plum trees, 3 varieties, 9 cooking apples, 3 varieties, 75 alders, 125 hazel and 50 willows. They were all for coppicing for wood chip in rotation. And then wild cherry, spindle, and elder, we won't harvest those or cut those ever. They're just for biodiversity and landscape value. Normally at this point in this presentation, I launch into lots of detail on system design, but due to the time limitations and the other subjects we want to cover, the design process takes these into account. And I haven't got the time to go into a lot of detail, but you must take into account aspect, rotation, windbreak effects, mass governing layout, irrigation, crop and tree protection, allowances for increasing spread of tree canopy and tree understory and roots, and how you're going to manage or what you're going to use the understory of the trees for. So I'm now going to switch to why we're not seeing agroforestry take up across the country a bit more. And the two subjects that I thought I would focus on, there's a lots of things to focus on. The two I thought I'd just pick up quickly are knowledge and money. So knowledge, you know, it's interesting. The title of the session is a little bit impatient, which is great because it's a really powerful, important tool. But it's also really important before anyone puts trees in the ground, they really think about what they're doing. You know, trees are in the ground for 100+ years. You want to put them in the right place and you want to put them in really well. You don't want to, like I say here, 40 trees planted well, better than 100 planted really badly. That's really, really important. There's lots of noise about numbers of trees being planted at the moment, not enough noise about the quality of the plantings. You know, we've got to get these trees to survive to at least 30, 40 years old, or they're not really going to do us much good in terms of carbon. So don't rush it, get a good plan in place. Every farm that's going to do agroforestry is a unique system and will require a unique approach. Agroforestry is a complex, diverse thing. You can't just take a system off the shelf and roll it out on your farm. To me, it looks like there's two ways we're going to go about doing this if a lot of farmers are going to take it up. And there's an interesting question. Are we going to get trained consultants to do tailor-made designs for every farm? My preferred method would be to train and knowledge up farmers with all the necessary knowledge, especially on trees, to design their own systems. They know their own land, their own production styles, their resources, their biodiversity. They probably know best which system, but they need the knowledge to design those systems. Agroforestry takes a long time for financial returns. Benefits to society are really fast. Biodiversity comes literally almost immediately. Fungal networks, soil sequestration, these things start happening pretty quickly. Farmers' financial return might be multi-generational, not necessarily their sons or daughters. It might well be their granddaughters and their grandchildren that get the true financial return. Luckily, there are incentives just coming down the line. So all the new ELM stuff, the farm sustainable farm incentive, and all the associated schemes that are slowly being released now do look like they're going to stump up money for agroforestry. This, however, may well be leading to the delay because basically people don't want to plant now if they think they might be able to get paid for planting in 2 or 3 years' time. And there's uncertainty about how the grants are going to meet the agroforestry planting. You know, are we going to get paid by the area of agroforestry or by the number of trees? What proportion of the cost is going to get covered? You know, is it protection, labor, mulching, maintenance, the trees, you know, or is it just going to be a couple of those things? Woodland Trust, for me, they covered the tree cost and the protection cost, and we covered the rest of the costs, and that worked well for us. But this unknowing might well be leading to a delay, which should be a good opportunity to crack on with the design process. And also, there's also that question that if you put in trees now, will the payments be backdated? Because if they're not going to be backdated, then people won't put in trees now. They'll wait to know what the grants are going to be. And then on the subject of funding, I caught the end of Guy Watson's session this morning on this. Carbon offset, natural capital. Is this trickle-down economics or is this greenwash? Personally, I would much rather that I had a relationship with our agricultural department that was taking tax money and redirecting it for public good and see carbon producers be taxed rather than, you know, agroforestry is a key tool for cleaning up the future of agriculture. It shouldn't be an excuse for carrying on the damage of the past. And that is me done, Ollie.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andy. Covered a load of things there. A lot of knowledge and wisdom in that. Thank you very much. Right, I'll go straight over to Hannah Jones from the Farm Carbon Toolkit.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I've had a fantastic morning. My focus highlights were herbal lays and dung beetles and anthelmintic, so a great sessions organised. So I am a soil and carbon advisor at the Farm Carbon Toolkit. But Andy mentioned Wakeland's Agroforestry, so I had the great privilege of working alongside Martin Wolf a number of years ago. So on his agroforestry system at Wakeland's. But to focus on today, the work of the Farm Carbon Toolkit involves carbon footprinting, a whole range of farms and businesses with particular emphasis on soils and soil health. We provide a range of services and tools to inspire real change to allow farmers and others to understand the impact of where the greenhouse gases are coming from and how to make a difference. So why carbon footprint? It's useful to measure the carbon and identify the amount and source of the three main greenhouse gases. Identify the areas where you are providing sequestration and offsetting capabilities. Very important to create a baseline as soon as possible. And within this, we can develop a positive narrative within agriculture, which is very much needed. And through our carbon calculator, it's possible to model future possible management strategies, which will support some decision making. So today I'm going to hone in on agroforestry systems and carbon footprinting agroforestry, very brief as is necessary within this session. So it's going to be a very broad overview, but within that I'm going to highlight some areas where greater detail and greater accuracy of information is needed to really highlight the absolute value of these agroforestry systems compared to an equivalent monoculture, if you'll excuse the expression. So a carbon calculation is very simple. We look at total emissions from that farm, which will include livestock, for example, fertilizers, feed and fuels. We calculate total sequestration, hedgerows, trees, but we pay particular attention to soil organic matter and assess, if possible, down to ½ metre. To get a real handle of what the soil organic matter is doing. And then to get the total carbon balance, you subtract sequestration from emissions. Okay, so within our carbon calculator, we have a number of categories, which you can see on the left-hand side of your screen. And I'm going to look at a change from monoculture to agroforestry in the first column and the effect on the carbon footprint of that business. When we look at projected effects of agroforestry, when we just focus in on the carbon footprint. So the first three aspects are relatively simple, so I can quickly dash through those. So for fuel, highly likely that tree operations will increase fuel use. This will obviously depend on the system that you're using, but for wood chip, for example, the operations will involve a significant amount of fuel, and which will include red diesel, such like. Consumables within an agroforestry system compared to a monocultural system, it will vary. It's unlikely to be a major impact on your carbon footprint. Again, it will depend on the system you have. And then for the inventory, we need to consider the embedded carbon within any machinery within the 10 years from the point of manufacture. So there's specialist equipment, as again, particularly with wood chipping. So you can potentially affect an increase in your carbon footprint from those three categories. So if we look at crops in a little bit more detail, in agroforestry systems, if we look at that whole complementation between the tree rows and the crops between them, you are going to enhance light capture. So the total carbon capture of that entire system is going to be greater for the agroforestry compared to just a pure monoculture system. You want 3 to 4 leaf layers to capture all the instant light in that system, and you have much greater capacity when you have trees within that. But if we start looking at what is in effect your cash crops and where the cash is coming from, and if we just hone in on the crops to start with, in young trees, 5 to 7 year old, you wouldn't expect a significant difference in crop yield or quality compared to equivalent monoculture system. But once you get to older trees, particularly those that are needed for large growth, you might for example, compare it to the timber rows that are grown in Wakelands Agroforestry, you can expect a reduced crop yield and quality. So those crops may include major effects, particularly for maize and potatoes. But I mean, just following what Andy has just said earlier, his planning and detail as far as spacing will obviously affect this base assumption, which obviously comes from the publication highlighted here. So again, that's a caveat to do with the design of your system. So the as a general prediction for crop yield and quality for mature stand, there is potential for that yield to go down because you have less crop residues. There's potential to have a reduced carbon footprint from those crops themselves. If we move on to livestock systems, so depending on what you have in those systems, there's if your production increases if trees are used for fodder. So the interaction between the gut microbiology and the biochemistry of those tree residues is highly complex, and there will be an influence on the emissions depending on the particular secondary metabolites and the ratios of starch and lipids, for example, within that tree fodder. So there's a big unknown within that area. So secondly, excreta is likely to be much more rapidly recycled within an agroforestry system. You've got much more diverse rooting systems. You're potentially much less leaching within it because of the exploitation of that soil profile by such a diverse range of rootstocks. Now, the question as far as welfare improvements for livestock within agroforestry systems, so Andy's already highlighted reducing the wind in their horticultural enterprises. So the same can be the case for livestock systems, reducing the effects of heat and cold stress, basically more infield trees. Hens are well known to have reduced stress. For example, the woodland eggs, when they have cover available for them to hide from aerial predators, for example, and trees can be suggested to allow much greater level of innate behaviour. So I've just been muted and then unmuted. Okay, so opportunities for innate behaviour such as perching and such like. And then there's a possible effects on key performance indicators associated with agroforestry systems. So you've got the complex interaction between potentially reduced stress, the effect of fodder, how will this affect time to first lamb or first calf? What about weight gain associated with potential anthromistic properties of those tree fodder, such as worm burden or reduced stress, and the likelihood of some diseases such as rumen acidosis compared to a standard sward. So all these aspects, these complex interactions, need to be further explored to see how an agroforestry system can really affect your sort of carbon footprint. So for livestock, how does it affect our carbon footprint? The carbon footprint may well go down or it may well stay the same, and this depends on the diversity within the system. So waste within it, so you might be looking at plastics, particularly within a system. So this is potentially variable or non-significant comparing a monoculture to agroforestry system. If we look at operations and inputs, as far as the carbon footprint is concerned. So there's obviously potential to include nitrogen fixing species within your tree mixtures. And there's a question of can that nitrogen move? How readily does it move from the tree rows into the crops? It will be affected by the age and the disturbance of those roots. So if you can reduce nitrogen input, so nitrogen fertilizer, and actually get that nitrogen fix from the tree rows, there's obviously potential advantages there. So it's well established tree rows enhance ecosystem services. So in a farming system with trees, you potentially can reduce the use of pesticides, the use of fungicides, because of the ecosystem services supplied by the parasitoids. And as Martin Wolf well established many years ago, physical barriers can reduce the movement of fungal spores across the field. And soil biology will obviously benefit from this greater level of plant diversity and the effect of those root exudates on the extremely complex microbial interactions going on below ground. So tree rows are highly likely to reduce soil erosion so over sort of runoff because of the sort of physical barriers of the trees there, because of the effect on the microbial diversity in the soils. Aggregate stability is highly likely to be enhanced just by the presence of those trees. Tree rows are likely to reduce the leaching of nutrients, again, because there's highly diverse rooting below ground. And what could be the mycorrhizal effects? Is there enhanced benefits through crop and tree mycorrhizal associations? And how do these affect water dynamics and phosphate availability? And again, this link I can link very readily to Andy's presentation when he's talking about needing to increase stability of production systems, increasing the resilience as a consequence of increasing climate instability. So when we go back to our carbon footprint, because of the enhanced ecosystem services, which are highly likely from agroforestry, we'd expect our carbon footprint to go down there. So moving on to sequestration. So one of the major areas that we really need to gain data through research is to understand the carbon sequestration from planting density in tree rows. So the growth habit, and the harvesting of those trees. So at the moment, we're just adapting area-based data from the Woodland Carbon Code, but for agroforestry systems, the growth and behaviour and development of those trees is likely to be really quite different, and that data is much required. So single tree carbon sequestration for top fruit is also lacking, and another set of data that we really need to improve our accuracy. So as far as the soil organic matter is concerned, we can predict the soil organic matter is highly likely to increase because of the diversity above ground, which will be ultimately reflected below ground. So the soil organic matter calculations will need to integrate the effects of leaf litter, the microbial effects, and variation in rooting depth and morphology, and the tree rows, whether you're using a mixture of top fruit or all sorts of options there. So that data, what is the potential for sequestering carbon below ground in these agroforestry systems? So carbon sequestration is likely to increase within agroforestry systems, and thus that sequestration is likely to reduce the carbon footprint of an agroforestry system compared to a monoculture. And then finally, when we do a carbon footprint, we also look at distribution, so direct sales, and that will entirely dependent on the particular business we're looking at. And just finally, just the last slide, just to finish off. Crop yield is likely to drop, but input costs are also likely to drop if you optimize the ecosystem services that can be achieved from your tree rows. Overall light capture from your agroforestry system will increase compared to a monoculture, but it's key to look at the economics of your system, because you must balance a possible crop income deficit, depending on design, as Andy mentioned, and how much income you're actually getting from your tree rows. So again, I'm going to skip over this very quickly because it's obviously covered previously. Marketing and processing capabilities of tree products need to be considered. And marketing of livestock products. So how can added value be achieved with those products when looking at agroforestry system? And I see there's another talk coming up quite soon on labeling food to optimize these advantages for businesses. And for tenant farmers, make sure you're closely linked with your landlords. There's a risk of needing to revert land back to original setup, or there may be opportunities to sell agroforestry as an asset at the end of a tenancy. And finally, what are the environmental benefits? There's a reduced cost of production, and what payments can be achieved through the Elm scheme and what is in the future. So I will end here and just say thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant, thanks Hannah. A deeper dive into some of the science around carbon and trees, which we're all hopefully on a learning curve about. I will, let's go over to Professor Steve Newman from Biodiversity International. He's going to talk about nut tree systems in the main, I believe.
Yeah, hi. So I'm going to talk about profitability, really, looking at the high value agroforestry things that we can do in the UK. So I'm giving the talk. I'm from a company called Biodiversity International, where we do agroforestry work over about 90 countries. I'm also doing work in UK with Abacus Agri Consulting, and today I've got assistance from Jenny, who is running a business based on walnuts harvested from an established silver pastoral system. So today I'm going to talk about 40 years of experience, and one of the agroforestry systems was actually established by someone in 1936, one of the walnut ones. Wasn't meant originally to be agroforestry, but it now is. So giving a slightly different slant on things today. The aims of the presentation are to look at key lessons we've learned from international. A lot of, I think what Hannah was saying was based on published papers where on agroforestry research trials, which one of the things is a lot of the crops reduce in that, but then they were meant to reduce because the research trials were meant to look at interactions. I'm talking about global experience where things are optimized. I want to identify UK opportunities just using a sample of 2 species, walnut and hazel. I want to identify UK barriers and ways of overcoming them. Jenny will be available for questions, particularly in relation to the practical aspects of the walnut silver pastoral system. So what is the niche for nut trees? Well, and you know, it's the main thing is to consider it to be like 4 dimensions, 3-dimensional land use, and you've got a system in time where you're trying to make things work better over a long period of time. Essentially, the good features are you get an income from the land while retaining flexibility for the agricultural land use and related income. So you get the trees producing as a separate revenue stream, beginning to get that within 15 years. Stability linked to it being perennial. Don't need replanting and constant cultivation. An incredible range of ecosystem services. Hannah covered some of those. Increase in asset value of the land if visual and other amenity is improved. And it's a platform for impact and socially responsive investment. So really there's a great future for these high value systems. Now, what we learned from the overseas work, you can see there that's a Paulownia system in China, where as the trees grow, the yield of the understory actually increases. In fact, if those trees weren't there, there wouldn't be any understory. It's such a problem of wind and climate there. So by optimizing design, yields can be stacked with 100% yield coming from the tree compared to monoculture and 100% underneath. This is the challenge of agroforestry design, to come up with a land equivalent ratio of 2. So we're optimizing. The research trials showed the conditions where understories could reduce. We're using that information to improve our design. By optimizing spatial design, harvested costs can be reduced. So we want to mechanize as much as we can. Fruit and nut systems globally in temperate agroforestry give the highest profit. Late leafing is the key. The most important aspect is sharing resources in time. Although these systems look like multiple layers stacked in space, in reality, they are doing that, but the key thing is the way they share resources in time. So Paulownia, as in the picture, is very late leafing. So if we can have late leafing trees, that gives maximum light available to understory pastural crops. And again, with correct design, you can improve soils and soil function and wildlife. So what's just a glimpse, the two most promised, well, there are about 6 or 7 new tree crops we could use in the UK, you know, including stone pines, almonds. We can even use oak to make acorns for acorn flour, but today we're looking at hazel and walnut. So hazelnut is late leafing, which is great. Over 20 products you can produce from hazelnut, including milks and oils, all kinds of things. Now, in our modelling work in the UK, we're looking at net income per tree based of about £148. And the target yield per tree is 10 kilos, giving an income per hectare of around £35,000. This is a payback year of about 7. And we're looking at the systems without grant. So nut trees, if you do a correct business proposition, are bankable. It's worth investing in these systems. We don't need any subsidies at all. But the thing is to have the right trees. It's not just any old hazelnut. These are very special varieties managed in special ways. Walnut, very late leafing, over 50 products. Net income £130 per tree, based on a price per kilo for the nuts of £15. Target yield would be 10 kilos a tree. Income 26,520, not quite as high as hazel, but the payback year is quicker. So these are highly lucrative systems. Before we did more detailed work on the costings, cricket-back willow was the most profitable agroforestry system in the UK. What does it look like? Well, the hazel is not grown as coppice, it's grown as a single stem, so completely different. And we want to be able to mechanically shake the tree with a shaker, or use helicopters like we do in Oregon to blow the fruit nuts off the tree. So the nuts are completely different from what we have in Kentish cob nuts. These are free husking nuts, and they'll just drop from the things to facilitate harvesting. That is a mechanical harvester that can be used for sweeping hazelnuts or walnuts. This is a walnut silver arable system established about 30 odd years ago. We learned a lot of mistakes from that one, so we're planting a different spatial configuration and have different trees. So those trees were predominantly tip-bearing trees. Now we're looking at lateral bearing, where we can increase the yield of the tree approximately 5-fold. Just an example in France, and they know how to make products from nuts, and there's no reason why we can't do that in England. So these are a set of walnuts products. Markets are just expanding in an unbelievable way. So just as an example, global consumption of hazelnut increased by 20% over the past 5 years. This is linked to nut milks and a greater range of products. This is absolutely tremendous growth in consumption. There's very few products which would match that. This is Jenny's system. So this is in the area where we planted some German walnuts 35 years ago. And then there was 14 acres of trees planted in 1936. She's harvesting the nuts there, and the cattle are very lively, enjoying what's going on. So the work's based on consultancy work, research work, and we work with a whole range of systems. People new to agriculture, interested in vegan approaches, young entrepreneurs with low carbon food aspirations. For further information, I would recommend you look at the Soil Association Agroforestry Handbook, where a lot of the mistakes that I've made over the years are made clear, and hopefully people will benefit from that in the design chapter. The key issues then for the UK, the key limiting factors then really you've got to get the appropriate varieties for your hazelnuts and walnuts. You know, you need to look at the nut quality and also that they can be mechanized and that the yields are going to be appropriate. It's not just go to any old nursery or garden centre and buy them. You need the specific things, and we need good sources of plant material. Need to know about non-plastic approaches to tree establishment, what kind of mulches and gars to use, how to optimize the configuration. So by reducing the tree density and increasing the distance between trees, having the right shaped trees, you can improve the light to the understory and to the trees themselves. We need to work together to improve processing and marketing, and we need to get clearer and simpler ways of getting paid for the carbon sequestration benefits. These are some of the key UK challenges. So the key way forward is to try and do things through partnership, because it's pretty complicated to do agriculture anyway, but to do the tree component, you know, and to market the products, it would be best done in a partnership. The biggest potential for me in the UK is looking at food forest and forest gardens linked to new towns. So the peri-urban fringe, there's ways of doing this with forest villages, forest towns. That could be an incredible opportunity for new entrants and new ways of doing things with agroforestry. That's based on a lot of the work I was involved with the Milk Keynes Development Corporation, where we had cricket bat willow agroforestry in the urban fringe, and that's still very lucrative today. We need to get a lot of grants for innovation, you know, that to help farmers learn and build up knowledge and be supported. I put some things there for further information. I published a thing on forest gardens in the UK linked to this, you know, peri-urban view. That was in the International Forest Garden Festival conference, and then also new rural settlements. I published a paper in the Town and Country Planning Journal showing, if we look back at what Ebenezer Howard envisaged, it is in 1897, it's of incredible relevance today, where we're trying to move perhaps now from a green belt to a green survival jacket. It really is, you know, these peri-urban areas are important for resilience in the towns for over the next 30 years.
Brilliant.
So, okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hope it wasn't too quick.
Thank you, Steve, bringing all that wealth of experience over the years to this. Right, we'll go straight to Helen. Thank you.
Hi, yes, so thank you, Olly. Yeah, I'm Helen Cheshire. I work for the Woodland Trust, although I did grow up on a small livestock farm in the Midlands, so I possibly know more about farming than I do trees. But yes, I work for the Woodland Trust and I'm their lead on the agroforestry farm on a national scale. So anyway, yeah, so as Andy alluded to, we have this scheme, which is now called Trees for Your Farm. Andy called it PER. That's because the original funder was the PER project, which is quite complicated. It was a French-based organisation that pulled in lots of corporates who were looking to offset their environmental impact rather than any sort of carbon footprinting. But it's now formally known as the Trees for Your Farm scheme, and our dominant funder now is Sainsbury's. But it is completely funding led, and it's really very much was designed to be a pilot agroforestry scheme to give farmers an opportunity to trial agroforestry. We started it back in 2013 when we had enough funding to fund 6,500 trees, and this year we will have funded 40,000 in this season. But it's very simply, farmers will approach us either by filling in an online inquiry, talking to us at events when we can be live, like at the Oxford Farming Conference, or through sort of contacts with farmers on the ground. And we will then, once they've submitted a simple inquiry and a map of their farm, we will allocate them one of our outreach advisors who will arrange to go and meet them on their farm, which I think is absolutely key. Together, the farmer and the outreach advisor will pull together an application which contains a full design of the scheme that they propose to do. We then have it's application rounds 2 or 3 times a year, and if the application is successful, we will then provide either free or heavily subsidised trees and protection. It's not a handing over of funding, we actually provide the trees and the guards. So it becomes a very bespoke scheme for those individual farmers' needs. Okay, so once the outreach advisor goes out to the farm, the main considerations, as several of the speakers have already alluded to, is to really pin down what are the objectives for trialling an agroforestry system. Are the motivations primarily to plant trees that will deliver those environmental services, whether it's shade, shelter, browse, and other public goods such as carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, or is the primary objective to produce a new product, just as Stephen was talking about with the hazelnuts and walnuts? Because obviously those designs and the species, etc., will be fundamentally different. And if it's the latter, then has a market been identified? And although the Woodland Trust is not an expert in all of these different areas, we will obviously encourage the farmer to think very carefully about what their market might be and what the requirements of that market will be. As Andy alluded to, yes, obviously the Woodland Trust, we're a conservation charity, so we do encourage the use of native trees, although in this particular scheme, we will support and supply some non-natives for productivity reasons, as long as they are UK sourced and grown. So I think it's really all about the right tree in the right place for the right reason. But so obviously we will encourage native because we do believe they are best in terms of helping to adapt to climate change and address the nature crisis. One of the most important things, though, is biosecurity. So any tree that we provide will have been UK sourced and grown, and we would encourage any farmer to ensure that any tree species they're planting is UK sourced and grown so that we can reduce any further tree disease. Protection, as several of the speakers have alluded to, is a big issue. And I think really good discussions need to be had, especially when you're in a livestock situation, as to how you might protect those trees till they're established. Does the system allow for actual exclusion of livestock for a period of time? And obviously that has an impact on the farm business. Can it be done with individual protection? But in livestock situations, the protection can be the key capital component cost. But also how many, what's the deer pressure in your local area? Have you got a problem with squirrels? These are all things that we really need to get to the bottom of when you're designing a scheme and costing it out. And then depending on the scheme and its objectives, what are the management implications going to be? Will the resource requirements fit into your current business staffing and systems that you have on the farm already? So there's lots of opportunities for this. It's just these need to be the things that need to be thought about. So what have we managed to do so far? As I say, this is a pilot scheme. It's funding led, but by the end of this season, we will have funded 200,000 trees and created 161 pilot agroforestry systems across the UK. In a quick rough and ready sort of analysis of it, roughly about 40% either were solely or included silver arable, which I kind of think of as more of the innovative side of agroforestry. So it's quite encouraging. Also a healthy quantity of what I would call boundary agroforestry, so hedgerows, shelter belts, and a lot of interest in silver pastoral schemes, which, although more expensive, if you're kind of, in terms of protection, etc., there seems to be a really growing interest in that as well. So without question, we could fund a lot more. Demand far exceeds supply, but as I say, it's funding led. So that's as far as we've got to date. So who are these farmers who are wanting to pilot and trial agroforestry? Possibly, when we started off, we would have thought there would have been more of the organic and those farmers following agroecological principles. But actually, again, we find that about 50% or perhaps more what you would call conventional farmers. So the interest in agroforestry is wide and is growing. Maybe a third of them are mixed farms, but there's lots of farmers, whether they're arable or horticultural, as Andy was describing, have also successfully applied for funding. So it really feels like it's a very broad street now of farmers who are starting to get interested in agroforestry, and a surprising number who are coming forward who are tenanted, obviously with their landlord's permission. And again, this can be seen as quite a big barrier, but there's quite a number of farmers who are getting around them. One of the most positive outcomes from this project or this scheme is the fact that we've got this wonderful collection of farmers who are the most amazing advocates at encouraging other farmers to start thinking about agroforestry. They're sharing their expertise, whether it's on social media, through holding farm visits, or speaking at things like the Oxford Real Farming Conference, it's sessions we put on. And it's really amazing to see the impact that this is having. Many of the applications that we get now are from farmers who've been inspired by their neighbour or a farmer they know who's already taken up agroforestry. These farmer advocates are not only influencing other farmers, they've been really helpful in our work with ourselves and other organisations to try and influence the policymakers. So whether it's Defra or whether it's the devolved governments, those farmers talking about their own experience is starting to make a real impact. But we're also involved in some more partnership opportunities. One is the Devon silver pastoral trials, where we've got 7 farmers in Devon who are trialling 3 different designs of silver pastoral schemes. And what's exciting about that project is that we've got commitments from Rothamsted and the Organic Research Centre to be gathering evidence with the farmers over the next decade. And so collectively we'll be disseminating those findings. So I think that's a really great opportunity to share different ways of doing it. And then we're also delighted to be working with Farm Ed on their demonstration farm in Oxford and their development of a living agroforestry textbook. So the scheme has just helped fund one of their alley cropping systems that's gone in this winter. And as a couple of the other speakers have alluded to, we're working with Farm Ed to design some bespoke training courses. We're going to be trialling where with our outreach advisor, they bring along a group of farmers who have expressed an interest. So we are again encouraging farmers to think about how they will design their own schemes. So I'll let you read these quotes, but obviously we try and build relationships with our the applicants who've successfully secured funding through us. So obviously COVID is limited. Normally we would go out, certainly for the first couple of years after receiving the funding the trees have been planting, to provide advice and see how the trees are doing. COVID has limited that, so we did a survey this year with farmers that have participated in the scheme. So these are some of the feedbacks. But what was really interesting was the comments that they came back. I think 93% of the farmers that responded to the survey had so far the agroforestry schemes had met their expectations. But it did come through very strongly that the advice that we provided was absolutely critical, and they would have, important in that planning and designing stage. And several of them would like further advice as the trees now start to mature, whether it's through pruning or thinning, etc. So there's a real need for that advice. And many of them do state that without our funding, they would not have had a go agroforestry. It really was that even though it's only a small amount of help and the actual business still has to input with the labour, etc., that difference made, that sort of small amount of funding did make all the difference. And several of them have then said, well, actually, it's now given them the confidence for their business to invest in agroforestry further. So as well as our Trees for Your Farm scheme, I said I would just talk briefly about what the work that we're doing, working with other organisations like the Soil Association, Organic Research Centre and Abacus Agriculture to try and influence, in this case, Defra. So we are part of a Defra-funded agroforestry test as part of Elm. So we're looking at what advice and incentives farmers would need to take up agroforestry in Elm. So we're halfway through this test. And it's basically the first piece was to do an evidence review. And just like the other speakers have said, the lack of knowledge and understanding of what agroforestry is all about is still a major barrier in the UK and in England. And leading on from that is this desire for advice. And obviously, agroforestry is quite heavily capital upfront before the returns are seen. So, there would need to be some financial incentives. So we're halfway through this test. We've got 6 farmer-led hubs, each representing a different type of agroforestry. And if you want to find out more details, then do go onto the Organic Research Centre website. We will be doing more activity during this year, so do get involved. So where have we got to in terms of influencing Defra? Certainly when I started working in this area, probably about 10 years ago, Defra had just decided that they probably weren't going to take up the CAP agroforestry options and were questioning us all as to, we don't think farmers are interested in agroforestry. So it's really refreshing to see that when they publish information now on elm, that they do say that they want to support agroforestry. So that's very positive. They are talking about designing a pilot agroforestry standard for the sustainable farming incentive component, but I have real concerns that they want sustainable farming incentive to be advice-free, or i.e. government not funding it. So that's potentially a barrier. So I think we've got a lot of work collectively to do there to try and make sure that certainly in its early stages is an enabling standard that provides that knowledge. But also local nature recovery should be a major component of taking forward agroforestry, especially larger scale wood pasture parkland type activities and where farmers collaborate together. So it's absolutely essential that we do get support through both the SFI and LNR for the farmers to take agroforestry forward. So finally, thank you very much for listening. And as we get to the question and answer bit, then it'd be great to hear what you think are the main barriers and how these might be addressed. But thank you for listening. And if you want to apply for the Woodland Trust scheme, I'll drop the link into the chat in a moment.
Right, thank you very much, Helen, particularly for bringing some good news there about the amount of take-up. I think particularly from conventional farmers, it's really heartening to hear the amount of interest that's out there. We're probably going to bump into the limitations now of having a time-limited webinar, because we've really only got just over 20 minutes for questions. The session will pretty much automatically end at 3:30, so we want to just finish just before that. Hopefully there are some questions in the Q&A. I can see that there are, but I haven't read them, and hopefully Bridget or Olly have been keeping an eye on that and the chat and can pick out some choice morsels and direct them at our panel. Is that the case? Bridget or Olly, are you there?
Can you find the one on grey squirrels?
I'm here. Yeah, the question about grey squirrels has got quite a lot of interest in the chat. I wasn't sure if Olly wanted to read out the questions or me, but
no, I can't. I haven't seen them, and I can't. I don't want to spend the time finding them. So if you could read them out, that would be brilliant.
Sure, that's fine. And so that was Rita asking what the suggested way to manage grey squirrels in the UK is for nut production systems. I'm sure there's no one answer, but I think that was directed to Steve. Yeah, so
basically you have to start from the design point of view to do all you can, so squirrels are pests like any other pests. You need to have some ecological knowledge to start with. For instance, if you want to just plant a couple of walnut trees for the nuts next to or in the middle of woodland, then you're going to have an incredible problem because you've got squirrels in the woodland and you've only got a couple of trees. If you're planting 1,000 acres of hazel agroforestry, which we're working on proposals at the moment to do that, then the squirrels are not going to be able to make much difference. Also, if you have a big buffer zone around, if it's an island of arable land miles away from any woodland, again, squirrels are not a problem. So think about the design. They don't have to be a problem. In systems we've established, some sites are terrible with squirrels, others are not so bad. Some people will not like the idea of killing or controlling squirrels under any circumstances. That's one group that need to consider different design approaches. On the other extreme, people think that squirrels are an incredible byproduct. Very useful meats, very high flavors, lots of health benefits. So lots of different things. I think, when you're designing agroforestry, you really need to be holistic and think outside the box.
Anyone else want to
give some food for thought?
Pun intended. Anybody else want to contribute on squirrels?
I would just back exactly what Steve said. It's not about it's integrated pest management, isn't it? Is the modern phrase for it, which is you don't focus on the pest, you focus on everything else.
Yes.
And if squirrels are a problem, it's because there's a vacuum in your ecosystem that they're filling.
Yeah.
So it's exactly what Steve said. It's right at the design, right from the beginning of the design process. If your intention is nuts, squirrels need to be part of that design from the very beginning.
Thank you. We've got a question from Emma about, well, we've got two actually. Why are trees for the farm not funding silver horticulture? And small farms are missing out on funding for trees as not classed as farms or community. I don't think that was directed at a specific person, perhaps.
Shall I take it as if it's directed directly at the Trees for Your Farm scheme? I mean, we do support silver horticulture because we obviously supported Andy's project and we supported Ian Tolhurst. So yeah, we do support. It's a competitive scheme just because demand outstrips our funding for it, but we definitely support silver horticulture. The scheme does have to, they do have to be what we would class as commercial farming businesses, but many of the farms that we've supported are tiny. So, you know, we just wouldn't support sort of more hobby farms. But, you know, if you have applied and you've been rejected, and apologies for that, but it's, you know, it is because largely we have more demand than we have supply for. But yeah, I have put the link in the chat for our webpage. So do scroll down. The Trees for Your Farm is a bit further down the page beyond our other schemes that we offer.
Thank you, Helen. There's so many questions in the chat box, so I'm going to go with the most recent one, which is, what are the established routes to markets for nuts and nut products? And that's from Jack.
So on the hazelnut, the establishments are the hazelnut. The main one is for the kernels, and again, you need the right variety of hazelnut to give spherical kernels and not the oblate spheroid, the ones like Kent Cobb and Cosford. So the global market is for the round kernels. I mentioned nut milks, they're really growing in importance. Maybe we could ask Jenny about her experience with the walnut products.
Hi, yes, sorry, just unmuted myself. So predominantly what we do is direct marketing. I think this is perhaps what is one of the barriers for entry for agroforestry, because the market is there, but it is a market that's growing and isn't established at the moment. So looking at the amount of planting that's going on, there's going to be a massive increase in supply, and it'll be really interesting to see how the market develops in the long term. But I think we predominantly market them as wet walnuts, but hoping to work collaboratively as more plantings go in to look at how we can, you know, for post-harvest treatment and how we can work out routes to market through that way. And I think it is really important. I know there's another session tomorrow on supply chain needs and how that needs. You need a diversity in supply chain and a change in the supply chain in order to support all of these new agroecological systems and products that are going to come on the market as we promote and hopefully increase the area of agroforestry. So yeah, there are established routes. You can wholesale. There is local demand, and there is a market there. It's just tapping into it. And when you're looking at the design of any project you're putting in, working out how you're going to be able to market that product, and the other considerations such as the labor cost can be quite labor intensive, and how that fits within your existing business and how the business may need to change in order to market that product so you do get an income from it and you can take advantage of the agroforestry benefits that will be available to you.
Can I just come in? There are broad categories overall. So there's the nuts themselves for selling them in various forms. There's some nuts are predominantly for oils, like walnut. Some nuts are very good for flour. So chestnut and acorns, that's a very good source of flour. And then you've got other products. So walnut is incredibly good for beauty products, dyes, all kinds of things. So the beauty of the nut trees is they're really multi-purpose, and it's down to, you know, there's a great potential for entrepreneurs to develop new markets. But Jenny's right, the starting point is the wet walnuts, so those are for pickling or for the fresh table nuts or dried nuts for use any time in the year. But you know, these trees are incredible in the diversity of product categories, not just the fruit itself.
Yeah, I mean, my perception is that there's very limited processing ability around the UK in terms of nut products. And so anything that people are doing is very much sort of on their own farm at a very small scale. And I guess as the supply of these, of the produce increases, we can hope, I think it's an area that we could look at in terms of partnerships and collective work, that farms in a region could work together to increase their processing capability and start making some of these things that Steve is talking about. And I guess in that sense, it's also useful to know who else is doing what in your area, and who, you know, farms doing similar things, growing similar products would be worthwhile for people, certainly considering bigger schemes who are wanting to do more commercial production.
Does anyone else want to add in on that question, or should we move to one of the others in the
I'd very quickly add that nuts, in a world where we're all going to supposedly, to help save the planet, everyone's going to be eating a lot less meat. Nuts are probably the key thing that's going to come in and bridge, you know, like we mentioned, milks, protein, oils, a lot of these things we can't kind of getting from meat. If we're going to reduce that, nuts are a big player in bridging that gap.
Yeah, let's go to something else, Bridget.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. So one of the questions is for Andy about what you use as an understory beneath the trees and how do you manage it?
So the absolute critical thing about understories is decide what you want and get it in before your trees. I think that was in a lot of early practitioners of agroforestry, that's a mistake. You know, they sort of realized the benefits and the opportunity of the understory, but they've realized it after the trees go in. Now, as far as ground prep, sowing, weeding, anything like that, doing it before you've got a line of trees in front of you is much easier than doing it after you've put the trees in. You can do it after the trees. On our farm, we established, the order we did it is we've got two different understories at the moment. One is beetle banks, just tussocky grasses, permanent, untended, heavy mulch around the trees, but the grass is just left mainly as habitat for ground beetles, slugs being a big problem in organic horticulture. So they were sown in the autumn before we planted the trees. So we ground prepped in the summer, autumn sowing of tusky grasses, and then we planted at the back end of the same winter. And then the more recent stuff, in fact, the majority of our understory is wildflowers, again, for all of the integrated pest management benefits to veg. So all the predatory insects, ground beetles, pollinators, songbirds, all that same stuff the trees attract is also attracted by the wildflowers underneath them. Same process again, we established that in the autumn, sowed the wildflowers, and then just scratched out with a hand hoe the planting space, planted the tree into it, and then mulched heavily, and then they all grew up together at the same time. But I emphasize massively, think about your understory and establish it before you plant your trees.
But I also add that it's important to have systems of adaptive management over time. So when you're looking over a 40-year period, you've got different opportunities. Early on, the understory crop's not going to be affected very much by the trees because they're very slow. So that gives an incredible range of things you can grow. When light becomes limited, then you need to think again. So the best things are a leaf crop, because understory crops will develop more leaf in relation to low light. So choose crops where the economic product is the leaf. So parsley is a good one that gives a leaf under very high levels of shade, or essential oils tend to increase with greater shade. So in China, we plant wheat to start with under paolonia, then we move to ginger and ginseng, and we find that the shade increases the value of the understory. And then it's quite surprising what shade does. So we've been growing potatoes as an agroforestry understory, and they'll tolerate at least 20% shade reduction. So it's having systems of adaptive management to be able to observe what's going on, look at the way the crop's responding as it grows in relation to proximity to the tree, and to the age of the system and adapt. It's all about learning and, you know, making small mistakes, seeing where it works and doesn't, so you can optimize the understory.
If I could just come in there, if anyone wants a little bit more information on that, or just something quite interesting, there's quite a lot on that on the Agroforestry podcast from the University of Missouri, looking at, and this is American based, but it's looking at growing medicinal plants in the understory and also at wild stewardship. So if you are interested at looking at like the long-term changes that might come about as the canopy grows and potential in that region, I'd recommend checking that out.
Yeah, it's probably worth saying following that, if people do know of good links to get information, there's a huge amount of information out there, but it's not all in one place. But if everyone's got any advice on places they've found good information, you could put it in the chat and people can look again if they look at the recording. And Hannah, is that a hand up?
Yeah, just regarding yield, no mention's been made of coppiced agroforestry rows with respect to yield as well. So you can maintain the sort of rate of carbon sequestration when you're thinking about sort of coppicing as well, and link this to the understory. So if you've got a full-scale veg rotation in the UK and you need to get potatoes in there, you tie that in with the coppicing of your agroforestry rows, will be a way of dealing with potential yield reductions from light interception.
Yeah, I'd second that. It's a really interesting part of the design we did at our farm was I think they call it phasing is the technical word, but linking your rotation with your coppice cycle and the crop next to the tree when you cut it down. It's a really creative, fascinating part of the system.
Great. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. Brigitte, can you pick something out?
On the topic of coppicing, Marianne asked in the chat a while back, and I saved this one, if you think almond trees can be coppiced, considering options, one blown to an acute angle in the recent storms. She was doing well for the previous ones for 8 years. So just a kind of specific question there.
Well, I've never coppiced many. In fact, I've never coppiced a single almond tree. I'll say that straight away. And they're not a big part of the coppice industry in this country. Never have been. They might well be in 15 years with climate change. My knowledge is that any hardwood technically will coppice. Sweet chestnut is a big coppiced nut crop in this country. Well, it's coppiced for other reasons, but I don't, if I'm honest, I don't actually know with an almond. I don't know, Steve might know better how it would respond to coppicing. How long it would take to come back is probably the big question.
Steve, do you want to say anything on that? Or
Coppicing of almond, I don't know anything on that, sorry. It's not something I've done.
I mean, I think in terms of design, the issue around coppice, isn't it, is a nut production it's hard to get both at the same time. Obviously, you increase your nut production by having more mature trees, and if you've got a very regular coppice cycle, that's going to seriously reduce any fruit and nut production. So it's a balance of objectives there and your design goals.
I mean, possibly if it's a remedy to the wind, you might just be better off hoiking it back upright, putting a cable around it for a few years and see if it holds itself back upright. You'll probably find there's an underlying weakness in the rooting system if it was the only tree that got blown over in the storm, or its geographical location in the field is very particularly exposed.
But we're all up for seeing more almonds in this country, so good luck.
So I'm struggling to choose. There's so many good questions. There's one from Nina who talks about the dilapidation needs and a big rewrite in the light of climate emergency, as does the pastoral covenants for land acquisition. It's more of a kind of point than a question, but does anyone want to talk a bit on that?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to briefly mention it. I think it depends on the stance of the landlord, really, and the duration of the tenancy. So you can be given dilapidation costs if you establish an agroforestry system and the landlord is not supportive of that land use change. So as when a tenancy ends, you can sell the agroforestry system as an asset, or have to pay to make that land back to, a field-based system without the trees within it. So I think really good understanding of the landlord's wishes, consider the length of tenancy. And sometimes it doesn't, I would say the landlords that I'm aware of, they aren't against agroforestry. They just need evidence of a really good business case. And as Jenny was saying, and Steve, having a really good understanding of the markets to make sure that that business change is going to be viable over the duration of that tenancy. So yeah, I think it's just an area that needs a lot of discussion among some of the big landowners at this stage.
Just one quick thing on that. It's also important if you're designing an agroforestry system, especially if it's not your own land or you're not your family's land, to bear in mind future usage, you know, and measurements of modern farming equipment are quite important to get into. So you can design a system that is silvo-horticultural, but as long as you bear in mind that there are some fairly set widths on arable headers on combine harvesters, you can design a silvo-horticultural system that in 15 years could quite easily turn into a silvo-arable system. So just a bit of future proofing and yeah, empathy to other farming styles, techniques, approaches.
I'm really sad to say that I think we're going to have to end it there. I feel we've scratched the surface. So there's so much to talk about, isn't there? And and in terms of also of how what we can do to sort of move things forward and getting more agroforestry, I feel is a whole separate discussion probably. But in order not to risk being sort of cut off mid-sentence, I think it's safer that we say goodbye at this point. So I'll just thank the 4 speakers. It's quite a range of different things, and I think that was to sort of partly to demonstrate the huge variety of things that are going on around the agroforestry at the moment, the different levels that people are working at, the knowledge that we've got, the knowledge that we still need to gain. Hopefully people saw the commonalities and it didn't all seem too scattergun. So thank you to the 4 of you for speaking, and yeah, please do look back through the recording to get any of the links or connections in future. And for all of you out there who are working on or planning some agroforestry, then good luck with it, and thanks very much for joining this afternoon.